Before I start my story, I would like to say only one thing. In our world, there's something that goes beyond the boundaries of reality, something strange and not amenable to any logical explanation. I suppose everybody would agree that we usually don't believe in various stories, legends, theories, and guesses. Sometimes we even may consider people who have told us about such a paranormal situation mentally ill. Perhaps after listening to a creepy story, we may feel some discomfort or even fear, but after a while, it passes and we continue to live our usual life. However, it lasts exactly as long as the very story that we so persistently refuse to believe turns out to be true, and that the person who told that legend, theory, or even story from his own life turns out to be not so mentally ill as we thought. This is exactly what happened to me a little less than a month ago. I was forced to leave my permanent residence, family, beautiful wife, and 2 children due to my mother's sudden illness. The stroke crept up unnoticed. I probably will never be able to forget that hellish night. The first signs of this terrible disease were discovered by a neighbor who came to my mother right on time to gossip over a cup of tea. It was she who provided first aid and called an ambulance when she saw my mother lying in the kitchen with a distorted face. Of course, I also found out about what happened immediately, and I jumped out of bed, put on the first thing that came to hand, jumped into my car, and rushed to the village, breaking all possible traffic rules. Fortunately, there were almost no cars on the roads and I didn't do anything stupid. It took me a while to get there, but luckily I found an ambulance at our house. I talked to the doctors, and even to the neighbor, who still couldn't get over the shock. After that, I followed the ambulance in my car to the hospital, where I spent the whole night. Only in the morning, I managed to fall asleep in the corridor of the intensive care unit. In a few hours, the doctors explained to me that my mother's condition was more or less stable. He said that there was nothing to worry about yet, except for the list of medications that he had kindly provided me with. After a while, the condition of the person most dear to me gradually improved, and she was transferred to the hospital, and soon she was discharged. My mother was no longer the same as before. She was like a completely different person, absolutely unfamiliar to me. She has changed a lot in appearance during all this time spent in the hospital. There was no trace of the once smiling and cheerful woman. Of course, at first, I blamed it all on the disease, on a long stay in the hospital, and the use of a huge amount of pills and other medications, still hoping that my mother would return and one day I would see that same smiling and cheerful person again. When she was discharged, I decided to move to the village for a while. After all, she needed care and someone loved next to her. Now we return to the very beginning of the story. I took an unpaid leave, packed some clothes, took my mother from the hospital, and went home. It was that day when everything started. On the way home, I tried to talk to my mother in every possible way, remembering the good and warm moments from her life, from my childhood, telling her about graduation, telling her about her grandchildren, about their success at school and at karate training, and in response, I only saw a poker face. It was as if she didn't understand me, as if I was speaking in some other language. But I didn't blame her. I knew perfectly well what a horror she had been through, and most likely it was the result of a terrible illness. At first, even in the hospital, I thought that she had lost her speech, but the doctor assured me that everything was fine. She talked to him and to the other hospital staff, sometimes even tried to smile. I have no answer why she hadn't been doing it with me. At first, it was extremely hard for me. It was emotionally difficult. It was the first time I felt extremely uncomfortable in the once bright house, soaked in warm memories. I had no desire to stay there, but I also couldn't leave my mom alone. For the next few days, I did all the housework, took care of the old lady, cleaned, cooked, and in the late evening, I was exhausted. I couldn't sleep properly. The constant sounds, sobs, howls from my mother's room didn't allow me to close my eyes even for a few minutes, forcing me to get up out of bed every time and run to her room. And once, in the middle of the night, I heard her talking to someone. At first I thought I was dreaming, but when I opened my eyes, I distinctly heard a voice from her room. Well, I got out of bed and went into the hallway, stood at the door, and listened. I've heard unintelligible words, but I couldn't find any sense. I came in and turned on the light.
Mom, is everything okay? Who are you talking to?
I asked sleepily. In response, my mother just looked at me with dazed eyes, as if she hadn't expected to see me here at all, and sometimes cast sidelong glances in the direction of the window located directly opposite her bed. Are you in pain? I asked her again, sitting down next to her. My mother nodded her head to the sides, still looking out of the window with concern. What are you looking at, Mom? Did something scare you? Mom immediately opened her mouth, as if trying to say something. You had been talking normally. I heard everything. Why can't you speak now, Mom?
Son...
She struggled to say that. It was obvious that for some reason it was very difficult for her.
The tree... It has come here again.
What kind of tree, Mom? Where did it come from? She raised her hand and pointed to the window. I got up from the bed, approached the window, and looked at everything that was in the yard. Mom, what's going on? Who did you see there?
Tree...
She muttered again. I stood there all this time, staring out the window, trying to find the reason for my mom's sudden fright. But apart from our apple tree, which has stood in the yard since my childhood, I couldn't see anything special. Maybe it was a shadow, I thought, shifting my sleepy gaze to the lamppost behind the fence. Yes, it was just the light that fell on the branches of the apple tree swaying in the wind, and the shadows from them, like the tentacles of a giant squid, tried to get into the house through the uncurtained window, which most likely frightened my mother. Having come to this conclusion, I closed the curtains and sat down on the bed. Well, that's it. Now you can sleep in peace, I said with a smile. She gave me the same frightened look for a while longer, and then closed her eyes without saying a word. Her behavior seemed very strange and incomprehensible. But again, everything was quickly associated with the disease. Turning off the nightlight, I left the room, closing the door just a little. I was incredibly tired during the day, and as soon as I leaned against the pillow, my brain instantly shut down, and I fell into the world of dreams. There were no more embarrassments with my mother that night. Thank God she slept peacefully until the morning. By the way, in the morning I was pulled out of sleep by a loud sound from the kitchen, as if something heavy and metal fell on the floor. Immediately waking up, I threw myself out of bed and ran out of my room to the kitchen. I was surprised to see my mother standing there.
Good morning, son.
She grumbled indistinctly, trying to steady herself by leaning on the table. There was a metal lid from a frying pan laying on the floor. Mom, why aren't you in bed? I cried out, being both delighted and frightened. How do you feel? And what are you doing in the kitchen? I asked her quite logical questions. She looked at me and smiled and said that she wanted to make me breakfast. It would seem that I had to rejoice at such a sudden good turn of events and not think about everything else. But still, I was at a loss. For several days, she hardly got out of bed, didn't speak at all, just looked at me with a strange look. And that was it. And here, so abruptly, she got up without my help and also tried to cook something in the kitchen. For sure, it was extremely difficult for her. She could barely stand on her feet. She didn't speak clearly, but still, her condition moved from the dead point, and this was very good news. The morning of that day was bright. The sun was shining insistently through the window. My mother was sitting at the table and kept trying to help me with the cooking. I made breakfast and sat down across from her. It was then that I found out the reason for her sudden illness. I could barely understand her, so I will tell you everything in my own words. Our conversation began with my question about the tree that had frightened her in the night. After my words, her mood changed. I immediately noticed it. I asked her if she was really so afraid of the shadow of the tree. Though, she replied that it wasn't a shadow. I asked again what it was, and the answer to my question was the story of that ill-fated evening. I will try to describe everything in her words. I was in the bedroom that night, lying there watching my TV show, when I noticed someone passing by the window. The room was covered with a shadow from that damned lamppost on the street. I approached the window and saw a tree standing there, right next to our vegetable garden. Its branches were moving, so I already thought that it was windy outside. But no, the laundry, which I washed that day, was hanging on a rope nearby and didn't even move. And then I felt as if I had been hit on the head. I looked closely and the tree wasn't a tree at all, but it seemed to be a living being. The branches were moving as if they were his hands, and he moved them as if trying to reach me. But when it turned its head and stared at me with its huge black eyes, like the devil's, then everything happened. I had a terrible headache. I felt my arms and legs were getting numb. I couldn't scream. I couldn't run away either. I fell to the floor, and the last thing I saw was this devilish thing standing by the garden, reaching out with its hands to the window, and even heard the sound of hits on the glass. I don't remember anything after that. My mother's story sounded pretty convincing, but I could hardly believe it. I just sat there, nodded my head, and agreed. At that time, I still thought that it was the result of the stroke, which could cause the hallucinations, but this theory was busted soon, and specifically in the evening of the same day when I went out to get some fresh air in the yard and decided to go to the vegetable garden. I was shocked when I saw, instead of the same apple tree that I had mentioned earlier, a small stump sticking out from the ground. It was then that I remembered that I personally cut down that tree 2 years ago, since my mother wanted to put a small greenhouse on the place where the apple tree grew. I immediately thought back to last night, when I could clearly see the branches of the tree swaying in the wind, casting eerie shadows from the light of the lamppost. And at that moment, my ailing mother's fictions turned out to be true. There is no other way to explain it, because there were no trees nearby. Even in the neighbor's yard, there were only vegetable gardens, fences, and nothing more. I ran into the house, and my mother was sitting on the bed in her room, watching TV. "Mom, we need to leave this place. We'd better move to my flat." In response, my mother turned to me and, with a frightened face, asked to get closer. "I saw the shadows again, and he was close." "Mom, I was just on the street. There's no one there. Let's pack all your stuff and go to my place," I said, my voice trembling. "Why did you decide to leave so abruptly? Have you seen the shadows too?" "No, Mom, let me explain later." "You've never been a good liar, son." Smiling snidely, she half rose from the bed. It was the last few minutes before I almost went crazy. As soon as I left my mother's room and went into the bedroom to get my bag and car keys, the sound of breaking glass echoed down the hallway. Throwing everything away, I ran out into the hallway and through the half-open door to my mother's bedroom. I saw a scene that was forever imprinted in my memory as the most terrible phenomenon that I had ever seen. A phenomenon that defies explanation and logic of a sane person. The window was broken, and something so scary that you can't even see it in the worst horror movie was reaching out to my mom. My mother sat quietly on the bed, as if waiting for her fate, her eyes bulging at the creature and her mouth slightly open. In the window, in the light of the lamppost, the semblance of a tree was clearly visible, but it definitely wasn't a common tree. It was something alive and insanely scary, a creature covered with wooden bark, with branches and boughs sticking out of it, stood on the other side of the window. It was staring at my mother with its bottomless eyes, baring its terrible yellow crooked teeth. There was a kind of wreath made from a variety of sticks, branches, and foliage on his head. But the most terrible thing was his limbs, which like snakes crawled into the room through the broken window. They were approaching my mother, who was still calmly sitting on the bed, waiting for I don't know what. I stood in the corridor and couldn't even move because of the incredible horror that clamped my body like a huge vice. After a few seconds of this kind of stupor, I saw the creature slowly sticking its head through the window and abruptly turning it to me, as if he knew I was standing there, watching this horrible scene. His blood-curdling gaze was enough to make my heart almost jump out of my chest. I fell to the floor, unable to stand on my wobbly legs any longer. I began to feel terribly dizzy, and I felt a stabbing pain in my heart. Just a few seconds later, I lost consciousness, but the last thing I saw before I closed my eyes still gives me an immeasurable sense of horror. As I lay in the corridor, writhing in pain, the wooden thing slowly drove its twisting branches into my mother, who still wasn't moving. Branches pierced through her open mouth, eyes, neck, stomach, and seemed to grow inside, turning the snow-white bed dark red, splattering the walls and even covering the ceiling with blood. That's the last thing I saw before I passed out. I regained consciousness the same night in the same place. To my surprise, I felt more or less normal, only my legs were shaking when I tried to get up from the floor and I had a slight headache. The first thing I did, of course, was rush to my mother's bedroom, but I saw nothing but the blood-soaked bed, the same blood-stained walls, and the same broken window. There was no trace of my mother. It was in those seconds that I thought I was going to lose my mind. Every second of those terrifying moments came back to me. I was recovering in my memory that wooden creature standing outside the window, the branches piercing my mother's body. Its eyes, terrible, bottomless eyes, which I will remember for the rest of my life. It was almost dawn when I called the police. The district police officer was first to come, so we were waiting for the investigation team from the city together. We had been waiting for a long time, maybe for 2 hours or even more. And while we were waiting, the local police officer decided to tell me one story. He said that during this month, while my mother was in the hospital, several more people died or went missing in the village under about the same circumstances. People were found either with a stopped heart or weren't found at all. He immediately warned that no one would look for the body in these remote places, and the police will be absolutely useless. They have already tried to find the culprit for the mysterious deaths and missing people even earlier. Obviously, they didn't succeed, and the locals talked about the fact that there is some kind of devilry in the village, because no human being could do that. It was obvious that the officer was extremely puzzled by the events that had occurred and couldn't give a clear explanation of them. The police soon arrived from the city, and a few hours later, so did my wife. We were interviewed for a long time, as well as other inhabitants of this village, and all of them told the police that they had repeatedly seen a strange tree that sometimes moved on the street or in their yards, and was very much like a human.